Audrey Wallace, and I'm a consultant with Hogan's independent consultancy team. I want to thank everyone for watching this video, and today's discussion we'll be talking about the 10 success factors to a great feedback session. I do want to mention there's many different ways to provide feedback or coaching, so choose the method that you feel most comfortable with. Success factor number 1. This is preparing for the feedback or coaching session. The first thing you'll want to determine is the assessment valid? Once you've determined that yes, it is valid, then you'll want to pick out the 3 different graphs. So in this case, the HPI, the HDS, and the MVPI graphs, if you're choosing to discuss all 3 during the session. Then once looking at the graphs, I'd like to first start with the MVPI. And so from the MVPI, what I do is I pick out those elevations for the individual because those are going to be the ones that I really want to talk about. Then I transition over to the HPI and I determine, are there any correlating scales that I could particularly use in that discussion in relation to the individual's job or some of the things that they might want to work on. I then choose to look at their HPI subscale scores to see, is there any in the lower range that could help me better understand the individual or when describing the results. Then I turn to the HDS and I look to see what are their elevations. And again, looking for any correlations across the 3 assessment tools that I could speak to, of course, always in light of the individual's job or what they're looking to attain during that session. The last thing that I do is I like to determine, are they going to be nervous during the session, or are they going to be negative during the feedback session, or are they going to push back from the feedback session? Some of the scales that can help identify that are the adjustment, prudence, interpersonal sensitivity. Of course, looking at their skeptical score will help as well. However, different combinations will help determine, if the individual is going to be nervous or if they're going to provide that pushback. Then the last part is really determining what are they going to take away. So making sure that you have taken good notes to ensure that your conversation will not only be beneficial to the individual, but they'll also leave with some form of indication of what they need to take away from that session. So, success factor number 2. This is going to be building rapport. Building rapport is one of the most important things that you can do during the feedback session. This is where you're going to introduce yourself, let the individual know why they're there, what's the purpose. It's also going to be where you're going to build trust with the individual. Success factor number 3. This is where you're going to outline the process for your hour's time with them or hour and a half time with them. I like to do this during the building rapport section because it gives them an agenda of what you're going to accomplish in that hour. However, if you first want to establish trust with that individual and then let them know what's going to happen, you certainly can do that as well. Success factor number 4. This will be where you're going to be describing the inventories. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to point to the 3 different graphs that I described in the beginning. So letting them know that the Hogan Personality Inventory, this is all about day-to-day characteristics. There's positives and negatives associated with high and low scores. So high doesn't necessarily mean that's better, low doesn't necessarily mean that's worse. I also like to describe what they're looking at. So just describing the 7 main scales and then letting them know that the subscale scores, they make up the 7 main scales. And that's it. Then I go to the Hogan Development Survey and I discuss this is an assessment that that helps us understand what happens under stress and pressure or what happens when somebody's not paying attention. And so just discussing again the scale ranges, so the no, low, moderate, high risk categories, what those mean, as well as letting them know the higher the score, the more likely the derailleur to emerge. And then I go on to the motives, values, preferences inventory. And what I like to tell them here is, this is all about what an individual is passionate about, what do they care about. It's also going to tell us the type of environment or culture that they would be best suited. And again, I talk about the scale ranges. So low, average, and high. Higher scores, these are your gotta-haves, whereas your average scores are more like nice-to-haves. And the lower scores, these are more of your take them or leave them, Hogan terms. So then I like to just summarize with the motives, values, preferences inventory. This is what you want out of life. Then I like to go into the Hogan Personality Inventory and let them know this is how you're going to get your values met. And then the Hogan Development Survey is going to tell us what's going to get in the way of their success. Easy way to make a whole lot of information sound a lot easier. Success factor number 5. In the Hogan guide, this is going to be feedback on the HPI. However, I like to start with the MVPI first, so we're going to talk about feedback on the MVPI. I like to start with the MVPI first is because it's what an individual values, or it's the inside of an individual, and so they tend to relate a lot easier to things that they know that they care about. Also too, if you have somebody that scores a very low score on the adjustment score, it's good to start with the MVPI, because if you start with the HPI, they're going to be more focused on, oh gosh, what are all the negatives happening in my results, or what are all the red that's on the page. And so it gets them to calmly start going into the feedback session with, okay, yeah, sure, these are some of the values that I really care about. And then when we get to the HPI, it helps to calm them down, and so it gets them to focus more on what the session is about. So when giving feedback on the MVPI, you're first going to want to turn their attention to the higher scores. Now this of course will be after you've already described what they're looking at on that graph. So you've already described what the scale ranges mean, as well as you're going to want to focus on the higher scores, because those are going to be the values for the individual. So once you've identified the scales that are elevated for that individual, those are the ones you're mainly going to focus on. Personally, I wouldn't talk about the other scales unless they ask about them, mainly because it's a lot of information, especially when you're using all 3 assessments. So MVPI, focus on those top values for that individual, and then get them to start asking questions around how this relates to their job, or how it's connected, or if it's a development for them, or if they feel they're not getting this out of their job or their environment. Ask them how that's making them feel, and try to determine a solution that will help them to see where they might be able to get those values met, or where the gaps are. Success factor number 6. This is going to be giving the feedback on the HPI. Now, if you're new to interpretation and new to the Hogan tools, then I recommend starting the interpretation with going scale by scale. So starting at the top, what you're going to want to do is describe adjustment, talk about what it means, and then talk about high scores, and then talk about low scores. Now, if you're more comfortable with the tools, what I like to do is, this is where I pull out information from the building rapport section of the key roles and responsibilities of the individual and tie it into some of the assessment results. I also like to refer to the motives, values, preferences inventory and any information that we glean there, and if there's a trend, that's where I like to start talking about those scale scores. So for instance, if you have somebody who's high affiliation and high recognition, as well as high sociability, this is somebody who really wants to be around other people, also wants to be recognized publicly. Well, the sociability is that avenue to getting those values met. And so there's a nice tie there, and if that relates back to their job, I will certainly start with those scales. So it's sort of a craft, understanding what the individual does and then tying it into the assessment results. Success factor number 7. This is going to be giving feedback on the Hogan Development Survey. You'll want to discuss what the Hogan Development Survey is, as well as discuss the scale score range. One nice thing I like to do when I start the session is, if you have somebody with 3 or 4 or 5 elevations in the high risk category, they tend to get a little bit nervous. I talk about, on average, people have around 2 to 3 in the high risk category, so it's perfectly normal. And let them know that everybody has derailment risks. There's no getting away from them. They're always going to be there, but the most important thing to consider is that these are going to be the things you're going to be these are going to be the things that you want to be more aware of, so they don't emerge when you're under stress. So this assessment, a lot of it's about self-awareness, as well as getting the individual to understand what triggers this. Is it a certain person? Is it a place? Is it a situation? So getting them to think back, how have I seen these things play out before, and how have they impacted my success? Once they have an example personally of what happens to them or what it looks like for them, they can help associating when these might emerge, helping them to have more self-awareness around when they're likely to emerge again. So just getting them to self-validate, how these emerge, what they look like for that individual, and just purely have a discussion. Have you ever seen these before? What does this look like to you? And most often people say, yeah, I've done that before. And so you'll be able to provide some coaching around how these are likely to emerge or impact their success. Now, if you have somebody that says, nope, I've never seen this before, this doesn't resonate with me, then they probably just haven't had anybody tell them about it, or they just haven't seen it emerge. And so what I always tell these individuals is to ask somebody at home, ask somebody at work, have I done these things before and what do they look like? Or ask a trusted friend, have you seen these things come out for me before? Success factor number 8. This is configural interpretation. Now, as you've heard, as I've been going through these steps, I've been doing the configural interpretation throughout the feedback. However, if you're not feeling comfortable with the assessment results and you've been providing the feedback in more of a scale-by-scale terms, you can certainly spend this time to provide any themes or trends that you might see throughout the assessments. And this might be combining 2 of the assessments or all 3 if you feel comfortable. This is also going to be a place where you want to do some conflict interpretations. So again, any type of trends that you might see throughout the assessment results. Success factor number 9. This is summarizing the results. This is a great place to where you're going to take all of the information that you've been talking about throughout the hour or hour and a half and put them into a nice, concise way that they can then add to their development plan. I like to take the 3 strengths of the individual as well as some 3 development opportunities that they can start working on. Whatever coaching model you use, you can then incorporate this into the overall development plan. Success factor number 10 is development planning. So this is just the next step where you take the information that you provided during the summarizing results phase and putting it into action. So this is the 3 strengths, the 3 development opportunities, or however you like to frame the feedback session and coaching. This is where they're going to have that information to take away with them after the feedback session. Well, that concludes today's discussion. Thank you for watching and good luck on your feedback session.